Välkomna till kvällens föreläsning i Judiska församlingen i Göteborg. Ikväll kommer vi att lyssna till Dr. Einat Wilf. Hon kommer att prata om hennes bok The War of Return. Jag vill påminna er som finns i lokalen att stänga mobiler. Kvällens i samarbete mellan Judiska församlingen och Sverige-Israel vänskapsförbundet i västra Sverige. Och jag hoppas vi kommer att få en trevlig kväll. Jag lämnar mikrofonen till min kollega och vän Jörgen. Varsågod.
Tack. Okay, and I'll say welcome in English to our, first of all, to our speaker and attraction today, Dr. Einat Wilf. I'll come back to your introduction, and I'll say welcome to those in the hall here and those on Zoom. I think we have a bit over 30 participants on Zoom right now. What we'll talk about today, I think, is one of the most important, or maybe the most important book on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and its possible solutions that has been published in many years. Even though for those of us who follow the conflict, and I say this with respect, Dr. Wilf, it's not much new, but you have put it together in a good way. So this seems very important for us, and we'll have a lecture by Dr. Wilf. We'll after that open for questions, and for those of you on Zoom, we'll receive your questions in the chat. And for those of you in the room, if you have questions, you can put them to me in English or Swedish, and I'll repeat them to the camera and to Dr. Wilf. For those of you on Zoom, it's very important you have your microphones off. And as Shachar just said, for us in here, to have our phones off in flight mode. So they're totally shut off, or they could disturb the microphones here. Yes, Dr. Einat Wilf has been a foreign political advisor to then Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres. She has been on Knesset in 2 terms, first 2 years in 2010 to 11 with the Labour Party, and then from 12 to 13 with the Independence Party with Ehud Barak. Her military career is a little bit intriguing for me. She was in intelligence and as a lieutenant. She is now a Doctor of Philosophy, PhD in Political Science, and I gathered right this day she ended a course on Zionism and Anti-Zionism, which is held at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. Okay, the book and the topic for this evening is this one, The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. Okay, Dr. Wilf, the floor is yours. We're waiting.
Thank you, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you. Sweden, as you will see, as I will talk, is particularly important on this issue. So I really thank you for being here. So I want to start a bit by giving background on why I even decided to write this book. Together with my co-writer, Adi Schwartz, we have devoted several years to researching and writing and speaking. And the question is, why? I grew up in Israel, in Jerusalem, very much grown up into the social and political circle of the Israeli left, the Israeli labor movement, labor Zionism. And as a young adult, my politics were the politics of the Labor Party, which in the 80s began to shift as a result of both domestic and international changes away from the issue of socialism and into the issue of peace. And that became, in many ways, the leading issue of the Labour Party throughout the end of the 80s and the 90s. And the main message of the Labour Party and of the peace camp at the time was that Israel has a path to peace based on a very simple formula known as land for peace. What was the formula about? The formula basically said that unlike 1948-49, when Israel could not have peace with any of its neighbor countries, all the Arab countries surrounding Israel, which invaded it and failed to defeat it in war, refused to sign a peace agreement with Israel. The only thing they signed were ceasefire agreements, which is why Israel at that moment has no borders, only ceasefire lines. And the reason was that, of course, the message was, we may have lost this particular battle, but the war continues, and therefore it's just a ceasefire, it's not peace. Now, after 1967, which was the second major attempt to undo Israel, of course, this one failed even more spectacularly, and Israel tripled in size with the Sinai Peninsula in the south and the Golan Heights in the north and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in the center. And the formula of land for peace, which emerged from that moment on, is that Israel now has assets, land, which it could exchange with its Arab neighbors in exchange for the peace that they refused to make with it in 48-49. Now, the idea of land for peace dominated for decades and really seemed to work. This was, of course, the basis for the agreement with Egypt. Israel handed over the Sinai Peninsula in its entirety, and in return, sign a peace agreement with Egypt. Of course, we can have an interesting discussion of whether it was or is really peace, but that was the idea. Israel handed over the land captured in 67, in return, got a peace agreement. The 1990s were really defined by the idea of land for peace and by labor governments trying to make it happen. We negotiated with the Syrians over the Golan Heights. We signed a peace agreement with Jordan when Jordan gave its claim to the West Bank. And of course, the highlight were the Oslo Accords, negotiations directly between Israel and the PLO over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. The 1990s really come to a moment of decision at the end in 2000. Ehud Barak, the head of the Labour Party, the head of the Israeli peace camp, who was elected on a platform of going to make peace, is going to Camp David. Camp David is, of course, symbolic. This is where peace negotiations were conducted with the Egyptians. And Ehud Barak goes to Camp David and puts on the table a far-reaching proposal that checked all the boxes of what we were told for decades at this point that the Palestinians wanted and that would lead to peace. So there was going to be an independent, sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. So if we are told that the occupation is the reason we don't have peace, that was going to end, of course, with the establishment of Palestine. So no occupation. Settlements. There were going to be no settlements in Palestine. They were either going to be removed or exchanged for equivalent land. So if we're told that settlements are the reason we don't have peace, that was not going to be an issue. Jerusalem. Jerusalem was going to be divided, including the old city and holy sites. Many people forget that. The Palestinians were going to have a capital in East Jerusalem, including in parts of the old city. So all the issues that we hear all the time, that they are the reasons we don't have peace, and this is what the Palestinians want, and end to the occupation, an independent state, no settlements, East Jerusalem, holy sites, all of these issues were on the table. All the Palestinians had to do was say yes. What do? They walk away. Arafat walks away in 2000. Later, Abu Mazen walks away from a similar proposal by Ehud Olmert in 2008. They walk away. Not only do they walk away to no criticism from their people. There's no op-ed from any Palestinian saying, are you crazy? Go back to that negotiating table and get us the state, the end of the occupation that we want so dearly. Go do that. Are you insane? No, there's no criticism, which means that by walking away, they were doing what their people wanted, or at least not operating against what their people wanted. And not only do they walk away, what follows is murder and bloodshed and massacre, which was misnamed the Second Intifada. But if I'm sure many of you remember, for me in Israel, this is the darkest time to live in Israel. There was a palpable sense that you are playing Russian roulette with your life merely by going out to have coffee with friends or merely by going on a bus. So Israelis were being massacred in the streets of Tel Aviv, in the hotels of Netanya, restaurants in Haifa, in Beersheba, literally days after the Palestinians could have had their own state, end to the occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem. So many Israelis, including myself, asked a very simple question. What do they want? What do the Palestinians want? They clearly don't want an independent state. They don't want an end to the occupation. They don't want to finish the settlements. They don't want a capital in East Jerusalem. Or they may want all these things, but there is something that they want much, much more. There is something that is so much more important to them that they're willing to let go of all these other things that they had in their hand. What is that thing that is so much more important to them? And what I realized and my co-writer realized both independently is that the answer was staring us in the face. That the Palestinians were telling us all the time what they wanted. We just didn't listen. And when we did listen, we didn't take it seriously. And what did they want? They've said it. From the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, a single Arab Palestinian state with no Jewish state in any borders whatsoever, pre-1967 or not. That's what they wanted. And that's what they've always wanted. And that has always been their top priority. Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II, if you know anything about him, he was no friend to the Jews and no friend to Zionism. But he understood the conflict. He goes to the British Parliament in February of 1947 to explain why Britain is giving up on the mandate and handing it back to the heir of the League of Nations, the United Nations. And he says this to the British Parliament: His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that there's an irreconcilable conflict. So he defines the conflict already in February 47 as irreconcilable. Why? He says, look, there's two people in the land, Jews and Arabs. So there's complete clarity. There's Jews, there's Arabs. Those are the two populations, the two collectives. He says each one has a top priority, what he calls a point of principle. The top priority for the Jews is a state. He says they want a state. For the Arabs, the top priority is for the Jews not to have a state. Now, it's a fascinating formulation of the conflict. He doesn't say, look, the Jews want a state, the Arab want a state, they can't agree how to divide Jerusalem. He says very clearly, the Jews want a state, regardless of the borders, and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. This is by definition irreconcilable. This is the one thing you cannot split. You can split the land, you can split the water, you can split resources, but this you cannot split. I define it as a conflict between Jewish Zionism, the Jewish desire to have a state, and Arab anti-Zionism, the Arab insistence that the Jews will not have a state. And that is irreconcilable. And Bevin's formulation has been the best predictor of the behavior of the sides ever since. That's why the Jews said yes to partition and have been repeatedly willing to make peace offers and have negotiations based on partitioning the land. Because for the Jews, the top priority has always been sovereignty, a state, regardless of the borders. And the Arabs and Palestinians repeatedly walk away and go to war because, as far as they're concerned, a Jewish state in any borders is unacceptable. So more than the Palestinians want a state, it's more important for them that the Jews not have a state. Now, for many decades, this was very clear. The Palestine Liberation Organization was established in 1964, before Israel controls the West Bank and Gaza. The Palestine they wanted to liberate was the state of Israel. As long as the Soviet Union existed, Palestinians made it very clear that their purpose is anti-Zionism. Their purpose is to eradicate a sovereign Jewish state in any borders. Until 1967, the main hope that they would achieve it by an all-out war. After 1967, and especially 1973, and the peace agreement with Egypt, they realized that was not going to happen. Then terrorism and economic boycotts became a major means by which to try to achieve it. But the one thing that remained consistent as a foundational idea and demand and dream and hope on how to erase Israel was this thing that the Palestinians called the right of return. Now, in the book, we explain and detail very clearly why this is not a right. So there's no internationally sanctioned legal right for Palestinians, either as individuals or as a collective, to settle inside the state of Israel in breach of its sovereignty. So it's not a right. And it's also by now not even a return. The millions of Palestinians who claim to have this right have never been in Israel, have never lived in Israel, and none of them have ever been its citizens. But the Palestinians believe dearly that they have a right of return, which is, what does it mean for them? They believe that millions of Palestinians, which include the hundreds of thousands that fled in the course of the war that they waged to prevent Israel from being established, that those people and their millions of descendants have a right, in breach of Israeli sovereignty, to settle inside the state of Israel. So not in the West Bank and Gaza, inside the state of Israel. The numbers, of course, are such that should this right be exercised, the state of Israel is transformed by this mechanism into an Arab majority state with a Jewish minority. Now, this idea of the right of return is the most fundamental to Palestinian identity. There is nothing more important in Palestinian identity than their notion that they are permanent refugees, deserving a right of return to a land which was illegally and unjustly stolen from them. That is foundational to their identity. And in the book, we also detail how that identity focused on return and revenge and perpetual refugeehood really was forged in the 1960s in the UNRWA refugee camps and the schools. Now, this is the most important thing for Palestinians. It's more important for them than having a state. And this is the mechanism by which they still hope to undo the shameful defeat from their perspective of 1948. They still hope to undo the state of Israel through this mechanism. And this is why it is by far the most important to them. Now, when I say that we didn't take them seriously, even when we did listen to them, is I've met with numerous Western diplomats and journalists, including Swedish ones, who belong to the countries that fund UNRWA. UNRWA is the UN still temporary agency that was established in the wake of the war, mostly to settle and resettle the Arab refugees, most of whom were in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jordan. Now, contrary to the myth that it's the leaders who were the problem, it's the Arab refugees themselves who refuse to settle or resettle because they want the war to continue. They refuse to accept the outcomes of the war. They refuse to accept that Israel has been born, and they refuse to accept that Israel's birth is something that they need to come to terms with. And as a result, they demand and ultimately are able to get from the international community the continuation of UNRWA forever in order to continuously remain unsettled refugees generation after generation who will one day get returned. This means that even in the 90s, when Palestinians said that they support a two-state solution, and even today some say that, the only two-state solution they imagined was an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza and another Arab state to replace Israel through this mechanism of return. There has not yet been to date any Palestinian leader or any Palestinian movement or any Palestinian of note whose vision for peace is a Jewish state next to an Arab state, as envisioned by the United Nations. The vision has always been and remains from the river to the sea. They say Palestine will be free, and I add in parentheses of Jews. Now, Western diplomats, and many, including some in the Israeli peace camp, believe that the Palestinians are not serious. I've introduced a word for that in the book. I call it Westplaining. Westplaining, just like mansplaining, is the phenomena where someone actually tells you what you really think or what you really mean. So to the Palestinians' credit, they've been very clear and very consistent throughout their history. But the West is Westplaining the Palestinian and saying things like, they're not serious, they know it's not going to happen, it's only a bargaining chip. Now, the idea that the right of return is a bargaining chip could have been legitimate in the 1990s, saying, okay, the day that the Palestinians will have a serious proposal on the table, they will exchange the right of return, again, which is not a right, for a sovereign state. But this is not a legitimate worldview now, because we now know that Palestinians have chosen to do the exact opposite. Rather than bargain the right of return in order to get a state, they've bargained away a state several times in order to keep fighting for return. So this continues to be their top priority, and Western diplomats who say otherwise are either willfully blind or just don't want to deal with it. Sometimes they say things like, oh, the Palestinians know it's not going to happen. And my answer is, open a map and look at the region. There are 7 million Jews seeking to maintain a sovereign state surrounded by 500 million Arabs, backed by 1.5 billion Muslims. When the Palestinians believe that Zionism is a temporary experiment that will disappear like the Crusaders, like the French from Algeria, like recently they said the Americans from Afghanistan, they're not being irrational. They rationally conclude that all they need to do is wait us out. Another generation, another 5 generations. At the end of it, the land, the territory will be Arab and the Jews will be out or a minority, but there will be no sovereign Jewish state anymore. So their vision is very clear, and it also makes it very clear why they refuse to compromise. Because why compromise with a temporary entity, Israel, that is destined to disappear in a generation or 5? So this is their worldview. They're very consistent. And one of the things that we write against in the book is that Western indulgence of this Palestinian vision is extending the conflict. Because if you look at all other refugee groups throughout the 20th century, none of them were indulged like the Palestinians in this notion that their refugee life continues for generation after generation, and one day they'll be able to turn back the clock and turn back the war, and it will be just as it was before. Throughout the 20th century, as empires receded and nation states were established, there were brutal wars, borders were created, tens of millions of people fled across these newly created borders. And what was the message to all of them? The message to all of them was tough, tragic, move on. That's it. It's, yes, you lost your home. This is sad. You're now in a place that you didn't know before, but build a new life. This is it. There's no going back. And the reason that the message has been there's no going back is that it was understood that if the message is there is going back, then this would be a recipe for perpetual war. In the book, we bring a beautiful example of another refugee agency that was established at the same time as UNRWA, also temporary, called UNCRA. K is for Korea. It's the same time. 2 million Korean refugees, 3 times more than the Palestinians, are settled by UNCRA in the south. They don't get a right of return. They're not indulged. They're settled within 3 to 4 years with about a quarter of the budget of UNRWA. And UNCRA is dismantled as a temporary agency after a few years. And look at South Korea today. Imagine if they had tens of millions of people living in slums, calling them refugee camps and seething with revenge. I mean, that would have been endless war. And this is what the Palestinians were allowed to do and were indulged by the West. They were indulged in this idea that they could wage perpetual war against Israel. And unfortunately, Sweden is one of the top supporters and funders of UNRWA, which literally extends the conflict for more generations. Rather than forcing the Palestinians to reckon with the fact that the war of 1948 is over, and therefore they need to move on and develop a vision of statehood whereby they can have a state next to Israel, but not instead of Israel, rather than forcing the Palestinians to go through the same painful process that tens of millions of refugees around the world had to do, they are being indulged generation after generation to keep the war alive. And in the book, we have a simple line that says, for there to be peace, the war must end. Basic, right? We cannot make peace until it's obvious that the war has ended. As long as there is one side that in their mind continues to live the war and engage in the war and hope for victory, then of course they're not going to sign any peace agreement. Of course they're not going to compromise. They're going to keep fighting. And as a result, our message in the book is, if we are ever to get to peace, this process of getting the Palestinians to come to terms that the war of 1948 is over, that there's no looking back, that they can build their own state next to Israel, but not instead of it. This is the process that has to begin. To that end, UNRWA has to be dismantled. The Palestinians need to hear from their friends that they're not refugees, and that they need to move on. Those are not pleasant messages, but those are the messages that need to be given if we are ever to have peace. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Dr. Wilf deserves an applause, but we're not enough. Thank you. And to those of you who listen, you can prepare your questions if you want to write on Zoom in the chat window. I'll pick them up. I'll start with one question. I said in the introduction, Dr. Wilf, that in fact you didn't really, for me, say much new, because the Palestinians have said this all the time. So my question is, how is it that the Western world and also many Israelis have refused to hear? Why didn't we hear what they said?
So you're right that one of the most interesting aspects of the book was how Palestinians responded to it. Palestinians, for example, would be very angry about the recommendations in the book, about the claim that they have no right of return, but none of them denied the central thesis of the book, that this is the most important thing. And in many ways, the Palestinian reviews of the book could be summarized as, duh, you know, what took you so long? We've been saying it all the time. You know, how is it not obvious to you that this is our top priority? And I think the reason, I mean, there are several reasons, but I think one of the main reasons is that if we accept that, then the implications of what we need to do are unpleasant. And, you know, I've written a lot of books in different fields on education and the Israeli electoral system. And at one point I tried to think, this is a very kind of weird range of topics. Is there something that connects them? And I realized that all my books have the same message, which is there are no shortcuts. And it's not a pleasant message. Throughout life, we hope for shortcuts. Land for Peace was incredibly attractive because it was simple and it was short. The process of signing a peace agreement and handing over land, it's a very short process once you decide it. So this was very attractive. What I'm saying are things that take a long time. In the book, for example, we compare the situation to the German refugees. I'm sure you know a bit of the story. After Germany already signs an unconditional surrender, so the war is over. Germany has surrendered. Germany is occupied. So there's no question, it's not a ceasefire, right? It's complete unconditional surrender. After the war, 14 million Germans, ethnic Germans, are expelled, forcefully expelled from what becomes Western Poland and Czechoslovakia, the Sudeten. This is not in the course of war. The Palestinian refugees, they fled in war. Towards the end, some of them were expelled, but it was in war as a result of military processes. This is after the war, after surrender, and 14 million ethnic Germans are brutally expelled. And in the book, we include some of the brutal descriptions so that people kind of really get a sense what it was. Now, do the Germans want the territory back? Yes. Do they want to return to their homes? Of course. They even have a name for it. They call it Heimkehr, kind of the German right of return. Are they indulged? No, of course not. No one in the world imagines indulging those German refugees in the idea of return. Now, no one indulges them. The war is over. They surrendered. And it still takes an entire generation for a Willy Brandt to emerge and to sign an agreement with Poland that recognizes the border, and for Willy Brandt to give a speech to the German refugees and to tell them it's over. We are never going to get those lands back. They have been gambled away a long time ago. We need to look to the future. In the book, we bring Willy Brandt's speech and we say, just do a cut and paste for a Palestinian leader, and then we know that the war is over and that we can have peace. But it took a whole generation from the moment that the Germans surrendered, that the West refused to indulge any notion of return until they finally accepted it. So this is a really tough process. The world has to mobilize to tell the Palestinians some really tough things. And nobody wants to do that, especially when the Palestinians have cultivated this image of the underdog, which of course they're not, but they've cultivated that image, and people always feel like Sweden, when it's funding UNRWA, that this is all humanitarian and it's just helping them, when it's exactly the contrary. So I think a lot of it has to do about running away from dealing with the consequences and having to do a lot of unpleasant things. Part of it, I think, especially in the West, has to do a bit with some neo-colonial attitude, which never lets the people speak for themselves. So the Palestinians speak very clearly, but somehow people think they can speak over them and they can explain them away. And I think also what plays into it are some ancient Western views, is that it's always the Jews are the ones who do something, and the Palestinians are always reactive. It couldn't be that the Palestinians have their own vision, and it's actually a very annihilationist vision. No, they're always just victims responding. So I think a lot of things come together, but for me, I believe the primary one is that no one wants to do the hard work, because my argument is that to get to peace, we need nothing less than the transformation of the Palestinian identity. The Palestinian ethos, what it means to be a Palestinian, has to change. This is not something small. This is not something marginal. Now, again, these transformations have happened in history, which is why I call myself a long-term optimist. But they haven't happened without real effort and pressure. And the Palestinians are not going to go through this process until they absolutely feel that they have no choice.
Okay. And on the personal level, I still see no hands here, so I'll put one more question to you, and we'll see in the chat as well. On the personal level, I gather you grew up with the idea of the two-state solution. Is that idea still a relevant idea?
For me, it very much is, in the sense that, as Reva noted, there are Jews in the land and there are Arabs. And I know that there are Jews who say that Palestinians are not a people. And Palestinians, all of them generally claim that Jews are not a people. Judaism is only a religion. And I half jokingly say that whatever one might think about the other, they both violently agree that they're not the other. So we have two clear and distinct collectives, nationalities, people, the Jews and the Arabs. I think they would benefit most from living in a political entity where they both enjoy overwhelming, solid majorities. Generally, countries that do not have clear, overwhelming ethnic, national majorities descend into Lebanon, Lebanon, Iraq. I mean, countries where you don't have a clear majority that reflects the country, of course, with civic rights and equal rights for all, but countries where it's not clear who the majority is are destined to descend into civil war. And we saw that. This is what happened in 1947. So I think both peoples would benefit from living in their own separate political entity. And then, of course, if the Palestinians want to engage in a confederation with Jordan or whatever, that's fine. And if they want to have a trade union agreement with Israel, that's fine. But I do think that for the good of the Jews and for the good of the Palestinians, they would both benefit in living in their own separate political entity, which means that the land will have to be divided. And like I said, the land can be divided, the resources can be divided, the airspace can be divided. What cannot be divided is Zionism and anti-Zionism. The conflict has to end on the side of one of them clearly. So either Arab anti-Zionism wins and Israel disappears violently through return, through Jews basically fleeing, I don't know. And then this conflict is over. You might have other ones, but this one is over. Or Arab anti-Zionism is defeated in the sense that it no longer seeks to try to eradicate Israel and accepts Israel as a legitimate presence in the region. Those are the only two ways by which the conflict ends. That's the one thing that you cannot divide. And once that happens, then you can have two states and you can discuss the details of how the border will be and the economic arrangements. But first, you need to end the conflict. You need to end the underlying conflict. And I have to say, these days, my greater source of hope for that is actually the Arab world, not the West. You're seeing more and more voices in the Arab world, especially coming from the Gulf. We see it in the Abraham Accords that are basically saying, enough, we're done. We're done with mobilizing the resources of our countries to the idea of no Israel. It's just not worth it. And if anything, we're actually embracing Israel, which is why the Abraham Accords are much warmer than the peace we had with Egypt and Jordan. We're embracing Israel, we're embracing Jewish life, and we're even embracing Zionism, which is why the Accords are called Abraham, because there's no better single word to reflect a change than to say Abraham, because the dominant narrative in the Arab world for decades, and still is that Israel is a foreign entity, settler, colonialist, imperialist, but basically foreign. And because it's foreign, then it's temporary, because foreigners are destined to be thrown out. So this is the dominant narrative. Now, if you suddenly sign an agreement with Israel called Abraham, well, Abraham is acknowledged by the Muslims as the joint father also of the Jews. It really brings up the idea that Islam accepts all three scriptures. It's an Arab and Islamic way of saying you belong here. You Jews are not foreigners in the region. You have a history here. This is your land too, and we embrace you. So these days, if I want hope, I do it more by speaking to Emiratis than by speaking to the Westerners.
Okay. I'll look around. Any questions in the room? I don't see any arms. Okay. And I don't see any on Zoom, so I'll give the word to Shahar.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for interested book and interested lecture. For me, you made it for me very clearly that we have to change the conflict from zero-sum game to non-zero-sum game, and I hope the world are going to understand it. But my question to you is more about the Arabs-Israels. After the last round of violence, we saw in Israel that Israel citizens that has been living in Israel for the last 75 years, and I know it's not perfect situation, but they live quite good life in Israel. But in the last conflict, they made it very clearly, not all of them, but a lot of them, that they take the Palestinian side. What are your thoughts about the Arabs, Israeli citizens in Israel, and what is their role in the future solving of this conflict?
So as with many things, we see some contradictory trends. First of all, of course, who are Israel's Arab citizens? Israel's Arab citizens, we need to remember, are literally people who, until the day that Israel was established, were very much hoping that this was not going to happen. And many of them were actually physically fighting in order to prevent the state of Israel from being established. So Israel's Arab citizens are people who wake up one morning in a state that they never wanted to exist. And and for which they actually fought very hard to prevent that it exists. And now they're the citizens of that state that they never wanted. What are they going to do? And from that moment on, you have two trends that have persisted to this day. One trend basically says, a bit like the Palestinians, this is not over. As long as we're in the state of Israel, our goal will be to make sure that the state of Israel is not Jewish. So our goal will be anti-Zionist. And you see it in a lot of the declarations and papers that come from various Israeli Arab organizations, demanding the changing of the flag of Israel, demanding the changing of the anthem, and a lot of course, demanding the change of Israel's immigration law that opens the door to every Jew in the world, basically saying we can only live in this country, which we never wanted to exist, if it has nothing that says that it's Jewish. Obviously, this is a worldview to which the Jewish majority in Israel has no sympathy. Then you have another trend, and sometimes it's the same person. A person might be torn, that says, okay, we didn't want this country, we didn't fight for it. In many ways, we fought against it, but it's a good enough state. Like you said, we're equal citizens, our life here is decent, and we just want to fight for issues that are classic minority issues. We want to make sure that we get our fair share of the pie, and we feel that we belong here, that our civic equality in law translates to a real sense of belonging and fairness. This is a worldview with which the Jewish majority has tremendous sympathy and has led, of course, as you mentioned, to tremendous strides. But both ideas continue to exist. And in certain times, we see violent flare-ups that remind us that in many ways, even within the state of Israel, the war of 1948 is not over. And there are still Arab citizens in the state of Israel who view the whole idea of a sovereign Jewish state as something that is foundationally unjust and illegitimate, and sometimes it also leads to violent flare-ups. But on the other side, we also have amazing developments. You have more and more Arabs who view themselves as Israelis, who identify with Israel, who are volunteering for the Israeli Defense Forces, who are serving as Israel's ambassadors. And again, the Abraham Accords are playing a very important role in trying to make that voice more dominant, in giving more room to that sentiment. But both sentiments continue to exist, and they reflect the fact that even within Israel, the underlying conflict is still about whether there is an Arab willingness to accept the legitimacy of Jewish sovereignty.
Okay, thank you. There is a comment from our internet participants about the peace treaty, the Abraham Accords with the Gulf state, that it was bought with the sale of American jet fighters, indicating more or less, I guess, it's not serious. But you think this is, the Abraham Accords is a new trend, that it's serious, that it gives us some hope?
Even more than that, I would say it's transformational. Now, this comment is very typical. I'm now living a little bit in Washington. You see it also here. When the Abraham Accords were signed about a year and a half ago, there seemed to be almost a concerted effort to minimize them. I think some of it, of course, had to do with people just not willing to acknowledge that Trump and Netanyahu might have done something right. Some of it, and the comments you had were things like, it's not important, the UAE is a small country, this was bought, this was a bribe, it's all about American arms sales, it didn't change anything. The UAE was never at war. These were kind of the comments that you heard, and almost really a general effort to minimize the entire impact of those accords. Already at the time, I thought they were transformational. After a year and a half, I think they really have the potential to change the region and to change the conflict. Why? When we signed the peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt, they were called officially peace, but in effect, they're best understood as non-belligerency agreements or security cooperation agreements, and they were very good for that. But there's barely any diplomatic relations, certainly no cultural exchanges, no tourism. Jordan and Egypt for decades were the leaders in anti-Israel resolutions in international bodies after signing the agreements. Egypt, I think, still is the #1 producer and promoter of anti-Semitic content in Arabic. And for years, Israelis were told, this is the best you can hope for. This is what peace looks like. As long as there's the Palestinians, the occupation, the settlements, this is what you're going to have. This is what peace looks like for Israelis. And then come the Abraham Accords. And they go all in. I mean, tourism and culture, and my Twitter feed is very much, I have a lot of Abraham Accord stuff in my Twitter feed. Every day, a signing of a new agreement. I'm part of WhatsApp groups. People are visiting. I don't know if you know, the Tel Aviv, Dubai is now the #1 line of Emirates. So within a year, it's the #1 line of Emirates. So you have cultural exchange and tourism and warmth, and Emiratis are now celebrating Jewish life and the Jewish calendar. And very soon after the Accords were published, I wrote an op-ed with 2 young Emiratis, and it matters that they're young, a man and a woman. And the op-ed opens this way: we are proud Arabs, proud Muslims, and Zionists. They didn't shy away from the word. And they basically say, we see no contradiction between being an Arab, a Muslim, and supporting the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in the land. So they, and why does it matter that they're young? Because first of all, to the notion that the Emirates is a small, the UAE are small and it's not important. Of course they're small, but they punch above their weight in the Arab world. For 10 years running, recently published, the UAE is the #1 place where young Arabs want to work. This is the place that for them represents an ideal. I have a Jordanian colleague who told me, you know, the interesting thing, you know, we used to look down on the Gulf, but now all of the energy, not in the sense of oil, but all of like the interest, the energy, the future looking is in the Gulf. He says the Levant, it used to be all in the Levant, now it's all in the Gulf. So there's a sense that the Arab future is now being shaped in the Gulf. And this Arab future includes skyscrapers and international universities and a space program and normalization with Israel. The young Emiratis talk about Arab anti-Zionism as something of the past, something that belongs to their parents, their grandparents. They're like, and in the op-ed that I wrote for them, this was really interesting for me. The one thing they wanted to emphasize all the time was the notion of wasted time. They were like, we wasted too much time being against Israel, and nothing good came from that. So there's a real generational shift. The idea of Arab success is increasingly associated with normalizing relations with Israel, and not like a cold peace, but a real warm embrace. A few months ago, there was a fascinating declaration coming from Iraqis who were talking about their desire for peace with Israel. And they made a fascinating definition. They made a kind of fascinating distinction in the Arab world. They said the Arab world is divided now between the world of war and the world of peace. This kind of goes back a bit to the Islamic thinking about the world of war and the world of peace. So, and they said there are countries that are in war, Yemen and Libya and Lebanon and Syria. And they were like, and we don't want to be like them. And there are countries that are at peace and they're embracing Israel, and we want to be like them. And they even amazingly, they understood that embracing Israel, they talked about wanting to atone for how they threw away their Jews in revenge for Israel's establishment. So you're seeing a move that says, we want to embrace Israel as a Jewish state, and we also want to embrace the Jews in this region. And we understand that it's been wrong to do otherwise, and it was not good for us. So I think that this has transformational potential. And if some F-35s were purchased or bought in the process, that is, of course, there's all the real concerns, Iran, and this is all existing. But I think if you were only to look at that, you would miss what's happening. And I can tell you that Israelis and Emiratis are really feeling that, and Bahrainis and Moroccans, and we're beginning to see it in more places. We're seeing something fundamental change. And it's not about Israel. It's about the Arab and Islamic future. What the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco are doing is they're saying, we want a future for the Arab world, a future of success. Remember how after 9/11, everyone talked about the failure of the Arab world, the deficit of the Arab world? And they're now saying, look, we have success. This is what success looks like. And success also includes embracing Israel. So I actually call the Abraham Accords a collateral benefit. In many ways, it's not about us. We're just part of a battle for an Arab future and a certain version of Islam that is taking place in the Arab world now.
Okay, it's a question about what you're doing right now in Washington, D.C. Tell us, I mentioned when we had this talk earlier, I know the course, but tell the audience what you've been doing. I think it's interesting.
So here in Georgetown has a visiting professorship every year for professors to come from Israel and teach about Israel. And I'm teaching two courses, one more generally about politics, and one which is called Zionism and Anti-Zionism. And it is a course that looks mostly at the last 150 years, but in some cases goes deeper in history. And it really looks at primary materials. So we look at Zionist thought and we look at anti-Zionist thought. And we look at the progression of Soviet anti-Zionism and Arab anti-Zionism and Christian anti-Zionism and Jewish anti-Zionism. And of course, we look at the various forms of Zionism and how it progressed and how Zionism moved from a very marginal idea among the Jewish people, which everyone thought was impossible, to the dominant and most successful one. And I must say, it's been a wonderful experience. I am looking for an opportunity at one point to turn this into a digital course so that people can take it more broadly. But it's been great.
And of course, I guess you also touch the United Nations on anti-Semitism and Zionism being what did they say? Racism, yeah.
Yes, of course, what we look at is the whole how Arab anti-Zionism came together with Soviet anti-Zionism with, in many ways, old Christian Western anti-Zionism in the United Nations. The Zionism as racism resolution, of course, is in many ways the pinnacle of the coming together of the Arab, Soviet, and Western anti-Zionism in one place. We talked about how this continues to the present day. I introduced the idea of the placard strategy of anti-Zionism, which by Zionism is equated with all of the world's evils. I call it the placard strategy because it appears in anti-Israel demonstrations. You have placards that say Israel, Zionism. Sometimes they just draw the Star of David. And then there's an equation sign. And on the other side of the equation are a lot of words, all of which share the notion that most people consider them evil. So Zionism equals racism, apartheid, colonialism, genocide, Nazism, recently in America, white supremacy. So every time this equation gets updated, depending on what any person thinks is evil. And the idea, of course, is to create in people's minds the equation of Zionism, Israel, and the Star of David with evil. And of course, that goes back to very ancient themes, but it also creates a very dangerous possibility for the future, because if you equate something with evil, you're also saying that that evil needs to be eradicated or annihilated. So of course, we also went through all of that. I told my students at the end of the class that I think they now belong to a very small group of people in the world who really know well the history of both Zionism and anti-Zionism.
That question produced a question on the internet. Is there any hope that the United Nations will get a majority for Israel when they vote?
So again, the only hope we have is, it's not the only hope, but the biggest hope we have is, of course, coming from the Arab world. If you're going to have to see, if you're going to start seeing changes in the Arab and even more broadly in the Islamic world, if you're no longer going to have this Islamic bloc of 56, 57 states who are they're able to negotiate. I mean, when you have a bloc of 57 states, you're going to get all the other states basically to do what you want because they want other things too. And you have a bloc which is about a third of the UN. But there's also some interesting changes happening in Africa. Evangelical Christianity is rising in South America. That might create some changes. So Asia, of course, is also changing. India, China, by and large, very favorable to Israel. But all of these countries are not going to change their UN voting pattern until they feel that the Arab world and the Islamic world is okay with it. So this is what needs to change. And it could. I mean, we're still at the very beginning of that possibility, and it could all fizzle out. But that's what would have to happen for the UN to change.
I'll give the word to Shachar.
I have a question about the part of anti-Semitism in the conflict. You talked about that you compare the Korea War. It was a war of the same conditions. We're talking about the Cold War, but had different solution. In Sweden, and Jürgen, you can help me with this, I think there is obsession about the Palestinians question, and it's not realistic obsession. And in my opinion, it's old school anti-Semitism. What are your thoughts about the anti-Semitism in the conflict and in the future solution to the conflict?
So I have a colleague who has a great phrase. He says, Zionism is normal. It's anti-Zionism that is not normal. So if you think about who actually needs to be placed in the docket, who needs to defend themselves, it's not the Zionists, it's the anti-Zionists. Zionism is entirely normal. A movement of a people with a shared history who are rising in the 19th century to demand self-determination in an era of this, receding empires, totally normal. Slovakia, Slovenia, Poland, Ukraine. There's nothing special about Zionism as a movement of liberation and self-determination of a people in an era of receding empires. Completely not special. That's Zionism. What is special, and I agree with you, what is insane is anti-Zionism. The fact that this very normal idea of self-determination for a people is met with virulence and obsession and violence has to do with the fact that those people are not Czechs, but Jews. And even though you could say, okay, the Arab opposition to Zionism is just an understandable effect of new people suddenly appearing in a land, Jabotinsky, of all the Zionists, was the one that was the most realistic in understandings that the Arabs would resist. But even he underestimated how virulent it was going to be, how implacable, and how long. He thought the Iron Wall, I don't know, would take a few years, a few short decades, and that's it. Remember also that he wrote before the Holocaust. So he thought, okay, there would be 5, 6, 7, 10 million Jews, 500,000 Arabs. Ultimately, they'll come to terms with their minority status. End of story. But the virulence of it, the intensity, the fact that it lasted for generations, the fact that the Arabs were indulged by the West, of course, could only be explained by this obsession with Jews. And that is so fundamental to Western civilization, which again is mostly secularized Christianity, which has an important aspect in the Islamic and Arab thinking. So yes, I do think that if any other people came to the land of Israel and wanted to establish a state, there would have been some conflict, but then I think it would have been over pretty quickly. But the fact that those people were Jews, asking and to be treated as equals, to have power, to carry arms, to have their own state, that brought out all the demons, which is why we're still dealing with it.
We have a comment here. Please give a lecture to the Swedish government on this subject, which can lead me to a question. You were once a foreign policy advisor to Shimon Peres. If you were to be, again, a foreign policy advisor to Yair Lapid today, what would you tell him to say to the Swedish government?
So I do that all the time, and I met with the Swedes, and I have to share with you something. It's not a Swede, it's a German, but I think the sentiment is the same. We went to Brussels at DNI to meet literally at the heart of darkness with the people who are funding UNRWA on behalf of the EU. We give them this lecture, and at the end of it, this EU Brussels bureaucrat, but who's German by background, looks at us, and I'm going to do it at exactly the same pace he did. And he said, so you want to tell me that the reason we don't have peace is that the Palestinians still want all of it? And Adi and I both go, yes. And you could see that like it was this, like he was for the first time ever even conceiving of that possibility. And even then, okay, you go back to your usual feeling sorry for the Palestinians and giving money. But we've given that and we keep talking, but we discussed it and you pointed to it. A lot of the attitudes are deep-seated. But if I were to go and we try, there's also a lot of work we need to do in Israel. My general argument, recommendation for a foreign minister now would be make sure that the West, in a variety of ways, sends the message to the Palestinians that the war is over. It's really simple. It's unpleasant, but it's simple. So please create a program that explains, and we have it in the book, that explains how to stop funding UNRWA. And still, if you want to fund Palestinians, be my guest, but don't fund them as perennial refugees. Make it clear that there's no right of return. You know, there's a series of steps we recommend in the book to just send the message that the war is over. And I think someone like Lapid could be very well situated to send the message, because he could say, look, once the war is over, we will share the land with the Palestinians. As I said, we understand that at the end of the day, there's two peoples here and neither side can have all of it. But we need to know that they understand that the war is over and that Israel is here to stay and it is not a temporary aberration. That would be my one focus. And my other focus, of course, would be on expanding the Abraham Accords. I think this is where you have the biggest dividends. If we can have more Arab countries joining, we will come very close to peace with the Palestinians, because the one thing that made it possible for Palestinians to fight with Israel for decades is that the Arab world and the Islamic world backed them. If the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were ever only the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, well, that conflict was over in March of 1948. March, April 1948, that conflict is over. By April 1948, the Arabs and Jews fighting inside the land is pretty much settled. When does it become the Arab-Israeli conflict? When in May, 7 Arab armies invade Israel to continue the job. And from that moment on are fully mobilized through the Arab League and boycotts and terrorism and wars to the idea of no Jewish state in any borders. If you begin to peel away Arab support for Palestinian rejectionism, you make it very difficult for Palestinians to reject Israel. The tragedy, of course, is that at the moment that the Arab world is slowly moving away from the blank check that it has given Palestinians for so many decades to reject Israel, you have Western anti-Zionists emerging to replace them and to basically tell Palestinians, no, keep fighting, keep fighting. It's about justice, it's about rights, it's all yours, you deserve it, you have the right of return. And of course, the reason that I'm angry about Western anti-Zionists and the policies of a government such as Sweden is that at the end of the day, Sweden doesn't pay the price. We pay the price. We pay the price in another generation of conflict. Rather than telling the Palestinians to end the war, Sweden and other Westerners are basically funding continued war. And we pay the price for it, not Sweden. So this is what I would do. I would make it very clear to the West that they need to stop indulging the Palestinians because we pay the price. And I would do everything possible to expand the Abraham Accords so that the Palestinians understand that they have no choice. They're alone. And as I said, they have to come to terms that the world will support them if they want to establish a state next to Israel, but that they're not going to get support if their goal continues to be to establish a state instead of Israel.
There is also another comment saying that Sweden supports UNRWA, which is anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. What shall we do to change this attitude? But I know, since I read the book, your agenda is not to reform UNRWA, it's to dismantle UNRWA.
Yeah, there's no way to reform UNRWA. I know there's a lot of people going around and saying, the books, let's change the books, or let's get more accountability. Or I love, especially when we meet with people in the EU, they tell us, no, they have more transparent bookkeeping right now and they're more efficient. And I'm like, I don't want an organization devoted to seeing me disappear, become more efficient and have more transparent bookkeeping. That's seriously not what troubles me. And even on the books. So the books don't matter. If you know anything about education, education is about the community. It's not about the books. So let's say tomorrow, UNRWA has Israel's books, okay? The Israeli books become UNRWA books. What do you think is going to happen? The people who teach at UNRWA, who are all refugees too, of course, none of them are refugees, they didn't, but who think they're refugees, those are the teachers, right? UNRWA is a Palestinian organization with an UNRWA name. By the way, that's also interesting. In the book, we show that UNRWA was initially going to be called REWA, relief, something. It's the Arabs who insisted that it be called UNRWA because they knew that there is a value to the UN letters as legitimacy. It makes a difference. So you have all these but it's a Palestinian organization with a UN name. So you have all these Palestinian teachers who deeply believe in the ethos of return and revenge. And what will they do the day you give them the Israeli Zionist books? They're going to enter the classroom They're going to tell the students, hello, students, please close the books and put them aside. And we're going to tell you about the beautiful orange tree that existed in my great-grandfather's house, which was taken from us by the evil Zionists. And you children, your job will be to one day take that back. That's what's going to happen, because it's the ethos of a people. And it doesn't matter what the books say, because for them, UNRWA is a mechanism of perpetuating this ethos. And just so we understand, when President Trump did the right thing and defunded UNRWA, basically said we're out. He did not do the right thing, but leaving it at that, he could have continued and hopefully gotten more countries to join and make it more permanent. But he defunded UNRWA. What did the Palestinians say? Oh no, how are we going to pay the teachers? They said, the American president is trying to take away our right of return. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, Swedish funding for UNRWA means that Sweden supports their idea that they have a right of return. And I think the Palestinians are right. And all the Western diplomats who are telling me, no, that's not what we mean when we give money. And the issue of refugees has to be negotiated and we don't want to prejudice and blah, blah, blah. No, the Palestinians are right. If you give an organization money for over 70 years, and the organization is devoted generation after generation to creating refugees who believe they have a right of return, then you can't say that the money is not a political statement. And these are the messages we try to bring, to expose UNRWA as a political mechanism for continuing the war of 1948, and to show that by giving it money, basically Sweden and other countries are feeding into the Palestinian belief that the world is with them in wanting to see Israel disappear.
It's about the end of your book, when you imagine when we dismantle UNRWA, Sweden and other countries could give their money for humanitarian aid to pay the Palestinian Authority, for example, for the Palestinians living there, and to other agencies. And the question is, I mean, if there is corruption within UNRWA, there is even more corruption within the Palestinian Authority, probably. So isn't it a bit naive to believe that that could work?
So first, let's start. UNRWA is not humanitarian. UNRWA is the social welfare network of the Palestinians. It provides the education system and the healthcare system for Palestinians. It's not, when you say humanitarian, people think like humanitarian relief. We're running to the scene and we're helping people in dire need. No, this is the regular, non-emergency, non-humanitarian funding of schools and health clinics, like you do in every country. Now, if Sweden wants to fund the social welfare system of Palestinians, that's fine. I'm sure, by the way, a lot of countries would love Sweden to fund their social welfare systems. You're very good at that. So let's say Sweden really wants to fund the social welfare system of the Palestinians. We're basically telling them how to do that. Give it to the government of Jordan. 2.2 million Palestinians who are registered with UNRWA. By the way, 82% of them don't live in the refugee neighborhoods. They're not camps anymore. Many of them are middle class. Some of them are wealthy businessmen. But anyway, give it to the government of Jordan. The government of Jordan is already perfectly capable of providing healthcare and schooling to its citizens. All the refugees in Jordan are citizens. Again, shows you the entire absurdity. Maybe here I'll open a parenthesis. The Palestinian refugee issue is huge in terms of the Palestinian ethos and mindset. But the Palestinian refugee issue is incredibly small in terms of the actual problems. So when you say humanitarian, there's actually not a big problem. As I said, 2.2 million of those that are registered are Jordanian citizens. They're not in any need. They don't go to UNRWA schools. Very little of UNRWA budgets actually is spent in Jordan. And the only reason that Jordan keeps this whole thing alive is because a Palestinian extremist murdered the king of Jordan in the 50s because he was willing to make peace with Israel and not demand return. But they're not refugees. Nowhere in the world are people born in a country having citizenship somehow refugees from another place. That's it. So they're not refugees. There's not a problem in Jordan. That's already 40%. Another 40% live in the West Bank and Gaza. Whatever your political view, they live in the area of the mandate, and certainly from their perspective, they live in Palestine. Almost all of them were born in the West Bank and Gaza, never displaced by war. They don't need resettlement. Like, it's not as if you need to take them and resettle them somewhere. Where they are is where they're going to stay. Another 1 million, about 20%, are registered in Lebanon and Syria. We know from recent data that most of them have left. My favorite Syrian Palestinian refugee is the multimillionaire, playboy, American citizen, father of supermodels Gigi and Bella Hadid. He's not a refugee by any stretch of the imagination. He is still on UNRWA's books in Syria because UNRWA doesn't track anyone. So almost all of them have left. The real numbers are probably about 200,000, 300,000 Palestinians who do not have a state. So Syria and Lebanon did not give them citizenship. So they're not Jordanians. They do not live in the West Bank and Gaza, and they did not leave Syria and Lebanon. That's about 200,000, 300,000 people. That's not a lot. That's about 5% of the numbers that UNRWA claims. It might be even lower. Those are the kind of numbers that the real agency for refugees of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, knows what to do with. Within 5 to 10 years, all of them could have citizenship, resettlement. And in terms of a real problem, it's over. It's only here. It's only in terms of the Palestinian ethos and identity and mindset that it's a huge issue. But in terms of like a humanitarian issue, it's a non-issue. So even in Gaza, by the way, in Gaza, the vast majority of the people who live in Gaza are registered as refugees. But they were born in Gaza. They've lived there all their lives. They're not refugees. And the reason that Gaza is in such a terrible state is precisely that the majority of the people who live there refuse to see their future in Gaza. They demand return. They march to the border with Israel, never to the border with Egypt, demanding Israel, which is why however much money you're going to give to Palestinians in Gaza, they're going to use that money not to turn Gaza into the Singapore of the Middle East or into the Dubai of the Levant. They're going to use that money to take back what they believe is theirs. So the problem is a problem of ethos, of mindset. It's not a problem of real need. And this is what needs to be conveyed. So when I say give the money to the Palestinian Authority, believe me, I know that the Palestinian Authority will reject that, not because it's corrupt. It will reject it because the Palestinian Authority represents the Palestinian people, and it has no interest in going against the foundational ethos of the Palestinians as perennial refugees with a right of return. But why are we making those recommendations? We're making those recommendations so that they will be rejected in order to expose that the problem is not humanitarian. The problem is not corruption. The problem is not the money. The money is needed as a symbol of the West's political support for the Palestinian continuing war to undo 1948. All our recommendations are not realistic in the sense that I don't think they're going to happen tomorrow, but they're shaped in order to show that if it were really only a humanitarian issue, even if it really only were a social issue, there are solutions. But that's not the problem. Those are the excuses. The problem is that the Palestinians still believe that a Jewish state is illegitimate. They want to undo that. They're willing to persist in undoing that. And as long as they're indulged, they will continue to make that their top priority rather than building a small state in the West Bank of Gaza, which is literally not what they want.
I'll pick up one more comment. It's from a Jew who lived many years here in Sweden now, who lived many years in Israel, who writes, I like what you're saying or what you convey. I don't see you as a Labour Party or Ehud Barak supporter. They would not support you, I think. Am I right?
So even when the book came out first in Israel in Hebrew, and everywhere when I came and spoke, I said, look, I'm a left-winger. I continue to support peace. I continue to support a two-state solution. And I also say, look, this book is not about how peace is impossible. This is a book about how to get to peace, which is very hard, but it's not a book about not trying. It's a book about trying. It's a book that says we now actually know what the problem is. We turned our eyes from it for too long. Let's look it directly and let's do what's necessary so that, yes, at the end, we can get to peace. I would like that very much. So in that sense, I continue to be of the left. I believe, as I said, Jews and Arabs would be best served by living in different political entities. I once gave this talk and a woman came to me at the end making a similar sentiment saying, you say you're a lefty, a smolanit in Hebrew, but you don't sound like one. And I told her what I said, I believe that ultimately there's Jews and Arabs here, and I'm a lefty because I think we'll best be served by governing ourselves in two separate political entities. And she was like, but I believe the same thing, and I'm in the Likud. And this is, I think, part of a broader political process that happened in Israel in the last 20 years, where both the left and the right have collapsed to create a very broad Israeli center, which basically says, look, as long as the Palestinian vision is from the river to the sea, we're not going to bother. And the number of people today in Israel, and Ehud Barak is certainly not one of them, who think that the reason we don't have peace is because Israel didn't try hard enough, very few. Ehud Barak would be the first to tell you that at the end of the day, the Palestinians, he went all the way, and the Palestinians, it was not good enough because that's not what they wanted. So as a general, he has some old ideas about UNRWA as a stabilizing force, but that's something we discuss in the book. But also the right in Israel has collapsed in the sense that people say, yes, if the price of true peace means dividing the land, we'll do it. Even settlers tell me that. Even settlers tell me, we understand that if tomorrow there is a Palestinian Willy Brandt, we understand that some of us will not be able to live here anymore. We understand that. Some of them just say, we don't think it's happening anytime soon. But I think there's a broad Israeli center. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, that we could have the kind of government that we have right now, because the major rifts, the major policy issues, peace now versus Greater Israel, these shifts these like rifts in Israel are over. We now have just a large centrist Israel, and that's where most people are. So I insist on calling myself a lefty also because I like a bit to mess with people's minds, but I do it because I want to make the point that at the end of the day, I do think Jews and Arabs would be best served by living in two separate political entities that, again, could have great economic and cultural relations, but that govern themselves. And that is the vision that I think is best for the Jewish people. And ultimately, this is where my interests lie.
Dr. Einat Wilf, we thank you very much for this evening. It's been very interesting. Another round of applause, I guess. we hope we'll have you soon in Sweden. There are many who should listen.
I would like to thank you in the name of the Jewish community of Gothenburg, and I hope the Israeli Foreign Affairs is sending your book to all of the diplomatic staff in the world, because it makes our job easier, and I hope we'll see you in Sweden. And I'm going to send, in the name of the Jewish community, a copy of your book to the Swedish church. Maybe they can learn about the conflict better and take better decision in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.